G'day guys. I said I'd do another video just to explain how carbon accounting works in agricultural systems and supply chains. Just to start off, before we go to agriculture, let's look at a simpler supply chain perhaps. Let's look at, say, the carbon accounting of diesel. So diesel as a substance is majority of these sort of long hydrocarbon chains. And if you look at just the mineral diesel, pretty much if we burn a litre of diesel, we end up with about 2.7 kilos of carbon dioxide emissions. But for carbon accounting, we've got to look at the life cycle emissions. So we've got to look at everything it takes to produce that. So we have to look at the chain. So when we're looking at what is the actual emissions of a litre of diesel, it's actually not just that. It's also the emissions we have to actually bring that diesel from oil underground to the point at which we apply those emissions, which is as the product to the consumer, which is at the bowser. So all these emissions, if you add up, they actually add another 0.7 kilos a litre of emissions to the supply chain. So the total emissions of diesel is 3.4 kilos per litre of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the reason I refer to equivalent here is because there are other gases other than just carbon dioxide, like methane, nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, etc. And they all have, but we add them all together to present them in carbon dioxide equivalent, just for simplicity and standardization when we're comparing, enables to compare apples to apples. So the other thing I would say to further compare apples to apples, if we're looking at energy sources, the amount of energy in a litre of diesel is different to a litre of petrol. And the amount of and then to compare between diesel and electricity sources, we want to look at energy. So when you look up for energy sources, often they'll present it in carbon dioxide per gigajoule, joule being the amount of energy we can actually get from that source. So that enables us to, they compare emissions of various energy sources. But that's finished with that. Let's go back to agriculture. And so we go from diesel to biodiesel. So biodiesel, we have a very similar chain, and we still have that at the consumer end. We still have that 2.7 kilos per litre of combustion. But we have, if it was a perfect cycle, the plant growth, that comes completely from plant growth up at the farmer's end here. So that's why I put these negatives in here as opposed to all positives. So that's completely offset, but it's not a perfect world, not a perfect cycle. We still have emissions along the supply chain to get that plant carbon and turn it into a fuel. So on average, we look at this biodiesel. We have everything from the inputs to with fertilizer, labour, chemicals, fuel, the emissions on farm, which I say it's mainly negative. Like we've got all the plant growth is happening here, but we've also got some on-farm emissions like nitrous oxide emissions and stuff like that, and diesel use on farm, transport, processing, and to the final product. So overall, we end up with 1.1 kilos a litre. This is on average, I'm just generalising here, of carbon dioxide equivalent compared to, mineral diesel, which is 3.4. So both products emit, currently the way they're done, both products emit, but biodiesel is obviously a lower emissions. So in terms of looking at emissions reduction, that's why a lot of governments are starting to look at bioenergy, not just in diesel, but other forms, as we try and reduce. And as Tags pointed out, as soon as we start plugging biodiesel into, or any sort of bioenergy into some of these inputs, that you get these cycles and we can start to actually reduce these positives. So all of a sudden, if we can get this supply chain emissions get closer to zero, well, we can actually get this final value down. So as we start to dial up their bioenergy or renewable energies mix into this, we can get closer to a zero emissions fuel, which should be great. Bring it down. The next one we've got is we look at, let's have a look at, so that's biodiesel, but a lot of farming is about food. So we've got a similar thing where we've got emissions from inputs on farm. Then we've got mainly where we have plant growth, but we still have, rather than combustion, we have our body metabolism. So consumers, when we eat the food that we produce on here, we convert this energy back to carbon dioxide as we breathe. And so again, there's, in an ideal system, if these were all renewable energy sources and everything was going, we'd have a perfect cycle where there'd be no emissions, because the energy we use by consuming food, is going to be offset by the fact we grow it. So, yeah, like I don't know what the actual figures are. Obviously there are going to be a different figure for every type of food, but overall, overall it's not a perfect system. So I'll just stop here before I go into the next one, which we're going to look at some different, look at hypothetical to go, well, can farmers make a positive, can we make something that is not actually contributing to emissions, can be something that where we've got more of these, plant growth and sequestration than we do actually emissions. And it is possible. But I'll sort of say that, because this is the counting, this is the sort of what we're looking at. And the key thing to say is when you read on any sort of these reports which are trying to detail emissions, there's positives and minuses, and there's numbers here, but there's no blame. No one's actually blaming anyone along the supply chain, because we are all consumers, so we're all emitting, we're all using these products, and the design of how carbon policy trying to work is to try and influence consumers and people along the supply chain to make choices that will reduce emissions or to meet certain target. So, it will just change. What we're trying to do is they're trying to do is change the choices we have along these supply chains, so that these emissions everywhere along here can become smaller. And perhaps this is it, which I think we will be able to do, is can we, maybe it's not just plant growth here. Maybe we also, as farmers especially, we have the opportunity to actually increase maybe this sequestration part. Now, whether that's planting trees or increasing carbon in our soils or others, but I don't do that as a farmer yet, but maybe that's possible. So, yeah, there's no blame here happening anywhere. It's just this is the product. This is the numbers. They're trying to say if as farmer, I say, and I can hear a lot of things on Twitter say, well, actually, this is carbon, up to this point, the product is actually sequestered more carbon than what we've used the inputs. And that is true. Like, up until this point, the biodiesel, they say it's canola, has actually sequestered more carbon than what we've used for the inputs. But we know what you have to do is the overall analysis is we know we're still ending up with some emissions. If we were to say that, okay, well, this is carbon positive, we're actually sequestering, this product is actually sequestering, by the same token, oil companies could say, well, actually, their oil is carbon neutral pretty much. It's until the consumer actually is the one that combusts it. Now, sure, you can say what you want, but that's pretty pointless. That would be pretty pointless to say that it doesn't. What we want to do is say, well, it's not. It's pointless to cherry pick certain parts and say, well, this is positive and this is a negative. What matters is that the end product is certain emissions, and ideally we can reduce this supply chain overall. So yeah, that's why we look at overall rather than. That's why I would say to other farmers, it's really, forever for any product, it's always going to be carbon. We're going to be sequestering more carbon up until this point, but products don't end at this point. We always sell our products with the idea that consumers are going to use it for some sort, and for everything I can think of at the moment, those products are combusted or consumed back into carbon dioxide at the end. So this is not very useful point to end that and say that, well, this part of the supply chain is, carbon positive. I hope that makes sense. It's the same with food. So we say, well, why is biodiesel good and food, and food is still in emissions? Well, yes, both have net emissions. It's just that biodiesel is substituting these emissions, which are greater. The issue you've got is we're trying to do with the same land, we're trying to produce biodiesel and food. So can we feed the whole country as well as, or feed the whole world as well as produce energy for it? That's a bit of an ethical debate, but I'm an optimist, so I believe we can. Let's hypothetically some carbon sequestration or net positive systems. I've used positive here to represent points at which we have emissions into the atmosphere, and negative as in we're taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we did get to this point, we said, well, actually we've sequestered a lot more, which we have. If we sequester carbon into this plant product, whether it's canola or hay or anything, if there's a point which if we can choose not to combust it, i.e. we might get a bunch of hay or trees or wood chips and just bury it under the ocean, hypothetically, I don't think anyone's doing it yet, we would actually result in an overall, there would be more emissions than, there would be more sequestration than there would be emissions. So overall, that would be a carbon sequestration system. The problem with that system is that at the moment it sounds ridiculous, because at the moment economically it would be ridiculous. At the moment, if we say canola for us to produce canola as food, it's say $500 a tonne Australian on farm. To produce that canola, for our fertiliser on farm emissions, probably we're about 400 kilos of carbon dioxide to actually produce it. And through photosynthesis, to produce that canola, it takes about, which is quite a lot here, 2.5 tonne of carbon dioxide per tonne of canola as photosynthesis. So net, at the point it leaves our farm, we're 2.1 tonnes of carbon dioxide, sequestered from the atmosphere into that canola through photosynthesis, Now, at the moment, hypothetically, if carbon got to $250 a tonne, all of a sudden, the value of that canola is equal to, it might be worth us actually just literally burying it into some sort of anaerobic environment so it can't break down, to sequester carbon. At the moment, carbon price isn't that high, but obviously there's some inefficiencies as well. So these are just hypothetical. But if carbon, as we increase our targets and carbon price does get higher, all of a sudden it may be economical for farmers to start producing either more energy for bioenergy, or even start sequestering carbon, or we might be able to start actually, burying this carbon under the ground and effectively reversing what we're doing with fossil fuels, which is digging up carbon and putting and burning into the atmosphere. We can start reversing that. But yeah, the economics would have to stack up. And at the moment, perhaps the price of carbon is such that it's price effective to start reducing emissions along these chains to try and reduce this overall value, rather than being, getting to the stage where we can do some pretty, funky stuff and get into this sort of territory. So that's it. Anyway, likewise, I'm happy to stand corrected of any of these numbers. I've just pulled out general numbers here, and if there's any queries about, or ideas for the next video, happy to take on board. Thank you. Bye.